That'll curb your love life, girl. Amber gave a start as she saw Granny Penn come into the canteen, dressed in a neat navy blue frock with a string of pearls around her neck. She wasn't ancient by any means, but she had always seemed so in her daytime overall and the rather stern hat she wore for shopping. Now, with her grey hair fluffed up a bit more than usual, she seemed softer, younger. But Amber scowled at Dolly's words. "I don't have any love life, and you know it," she snapped. "I'm going over to see if everything's all right." She didn't know why it wouldn't be, and her Gran didn't look in the least ruffled, but she had to find out. Excusing herself from the spam and scrape preparation, she wove her way between the crowds to where Granny Penn was sitting with several of her cronies. "You said you weren't coming, Gran. What made you change your mind?" She hoped she didn't sound too accusing. "Perhaps a little bird told me to keep my eye on my 2 charges," Granny Penn replied with a chuckle, and then went on when Amber flushed. "No, love. I decided that if our boys were brave enough to do their duty for king and country, then I should be brave enough to risk putting my 2 left feet on the dance floor." "You're not actually going to dance?" Amber squeaked. The other ladies beside Granny Penn tittered. She gave a little sniff. "Don't worry, my dear. I shan't show you up. I'll wait until there's a crowd on the dance floor before I add my 2 penn'orth." One of her friends leaned forward. "Your Gran used to be a nifty dancer many years ago, Amber. She wasn't born old, and she'll show you young maids a thing or two when she gets started." Amber groaned. This was a side of her Gran she had never seen before. To her knowledge, Granny Penn had never been to a dance in Amber's lifetime, but she shouldn't forget that there had been a long life before Amber was born. "I'd better get back to my sandwich making," she said quickly. She moved away, but not before she had caught Luke Gillam watching her. Oh, why? Couldn't she have been suave and sophisticated at that moment, she thought, gliding across the canteen floor in her lovely new dress, instead of scurrying back in her work overall, her face red with embarrassment. "What did she say, then?" Dolly asked, without too much interest, while Amber had a horrible vision of changing partners in a progressive old-time dance and finding herself trotting around the room with Granny Penn, of all people. The evening got off to a good start, with some lively music and a bit of a sing-song, and the compere urging everyone to dig deep into their pockets to put a few coppers or tanners or whatever they could spare into the collecting buckets. Even the threepenny bits they were saving for the Christmas puds could go in, he boomed. Since there was no dried fruit and few other ingredients to spare for making traditional Christmas puddings any more, it wasn't such a daft idea. As expected, there was the usual mixture of waltzes and foxtrots and old-time dances. There were plenty of ladies without male partners who were dancing together, and a few of their braver ex-school friends were already hopping about trying to follow the steps. The old-time dances looked the easiest, since all you had to do was follow the couple in front as you moved around the circle, and when the compere bellowed out that the next one would be progressive, all the gentleman partners dutifully followed orders. "See what I mean?" Dolly hissed in Amber's ear. "Once the refreshments are over, we can have a go." Amber wondered if it had occurred to her that the gentlemen always danced on the outer ring. This meant that either she or Dolly would have to take the gentleman's part, and the other one would end up dancing with all the ladies in the circle. But she might have known Dolly would have thought of it. "You'll have to be the man, because you're taller than me. Besides, I don't fancy dancing with some of these old dears." "Oh, no. We'll take it in turns. Otherwise, I shall end up only knowing the men's steps, and that's not fair," Amber snapped. "Everybody changes partners, so it doesn't really matter who we end up with, does it? And don't call them old dears." As Dolly grumbled that she supposed it was fair enough, Amber had to concede that there were a lot of old dears here tonight, as well as a good selection of men in uniform, some walking stiffly, and a few with bandages around their heads or arms in slings. It was a timely reminder of why they were all here. But Amber was going to make very sure Dolly stuck to the rules. With any luck, when it was Amber's turn to dance in the inner ring, she might end up with Luke, if he bothered to join in at all. Right now he seemed to be deep in conversation with several servicemen, and her heart gave an uncomfortable lurch. He was keen to join up as soon as he could, and it didn't take a genius to know he wanted to find out as much as possible about it. She turned away as the buxom supervisor told her and Dolly to get a move on, as people would be getting thirsty soon after all the dancing activity. "You little maids take care to be pleasant to the customers," she said, "and especially to that couple sitting over in the corner. They may not feel like walking through all these folk to get their tea themselves, and it's brave of them to turn out at all, considering." "Considering what?" Amber asked. "They got some bad news a week or so ago. One of their sons has already been killed in France, and now the other one's being sent to some big hospital in another part of the country where they can deal with his spinal injuries. They don't think he'll ever walk again, and him so young too." She said it so matter-of-factly that Amber was shocked. The woman saw how the girl's face paled, and she gave her shoulder a squeeze. "I know I sounded a bit brutal, my dear, but in this job you get to hear a fair few such tales, and you have to steel yourself and not make too much fuss, or you just fall apart instead of getting on with the work." Amber whispered to Dolly. "Have you heard this sort of thing before?" Dolly shrugged. "Once or twice, but I try not to listen. She's always asking servicemen if they've been at the front and what it was like. She likes to talk about the gory details, but I just shut my ears to it. If you can't do nothing about it, what's the use of worrying about it? For somebody who looks so sweet and angelic, you've got a very hard streak, Dolly." "Do you think I look sweet and angelic then?" Dolly said, preening and ignoring the rest of it. "I'm not answering that." "Too late. You've already said it." They were prevented from any more bickering as there was a sudden drum roll from the band, and the compere announced that there would be a half-hour interval for refreshments. "That's our cue," the supervisor said to her small team of helpers. "Be as efficient as you can and see that everyone has what they want. You two young ones," she said to Amber and Dolly, "go and see if any of the older ones want to stay sitting down and want anything brought to them. Shoo now!" Amber felt as if they were being dismissed. They were good enough to do all the donkey work, but now they had to walk around the room to where people were sitting out for reasons of their own. "Oh no, I don't want to ask them," she said quickly to Dolly, seeing the middle-aged couple the supervisor had pointed out. The woman was wiping her eyes, and the man had his arm around her, his face full of misery. "Why not? They look as if they could do with a cup of tea." "Go on, they won't eat you," Dolly said, giving her a little push. While she dithered, Amber saw Granny Penn go across to the couple, sit beside them and take the woman's hand, and she immediately felt ashamed at being afraid to speak to them. It was what people did. They turned away from anything embarrassing when it was often when people needed them most, and it isolated them even more. She made her feet move forward until she reached them. By now the woman was silently weeping. It was more distressing than if she had been bawling out loud, and Amber's heart thudded sickly. But she couldn't just stand there saying nothing. "Could I fetch you both some tea?" she stammered. "And you too, Gran?" "I wish I'd never come," the woman moaned, as if she hadn't heard her. "Ernest insisted, saying it would take me out myself. But I knew I'd make a fool of myself if I did. I was all right until the band played that last song. It was one of our Bill's favourites." Granny Penn looked at Amber. "Bill was Mr. and Mrs. Traymen's older son who was killed," she said quietly. "It's been an ordeal for her to come here tonight, but it was the right thing to do, not to shut herself away like a leper." You bring that tea for the three of us, Amber, and make it hot and strong." Amber almost ran away from them, near to tears herself. It must be a terrible time for the couple. She had never experienced the death of anyone close to her. She hadn't known Mr. Thomas's son, but his grief had affected the whole school. All these young men were dying who were little more than boys. It was a thought that frightened her more than anything else so far. The wail of an air raid siren broke through the chatter in the canteen. The compere called for quiet for a minute, although everyone knew by now that every time Plymouth had a raid, they had the sirens too, and hearing the distant sound of aircraft and gunfire, it was assumed that that was the case this time. The man then announced that everyone was at liberty to leave if they chose, but from the sound of it the bombers weren't coming their way. Seconds later, everyone was doing exactly what they'd been doing before, chatting and drinking tea and ordering sandwiches. "The good old British spirit, eh?" The supervisor grinned to one and all. "It's probably poor old Plymouth getting it tonight, so I hope my sister and her kids have taken to the shelter." She spoke brightly, but Amber realised that her hands were shaking. This was a war that affected everyone in one way or another, she thought, and none of them could truly feel safe until it was all over. "I need 3 teas, please, hot and strong," she almost gasped to the helper who was pouring them out. "You'll get what you're given, miss, and no favouritism," the woman said, and then glanced across to the trio that Amber had just left. "Well, just this once." Against the background of general chatter and laughter and tears, the distant sound of gunfire and aircraft was an added accompaniment that nobody wanted but most chose to ignore, until at last the all-clear sounded and everyone gave a cheer. But Amber saw the sense in Dolly's philosophy. If you couldn't do anything about it, you might as well not worry about it. Easy to say, not so easy to do. But once the interval was over and the band struck up again, most people were determined to have a good time. It was what they were here for, after all. Once they had helped with the washing up, they could remove their overalls and mingle with the crowd. They joined in 1 or 2 of the progressive old-time dances, but as expected, few of the boys left their seats, and Amber had to put up with Mr. Veal's enthusiastic hugging on several circuits of the floor. It was almost preferable to take the man's part, she decided. Mostly, she and Dolly stayed with their old school friends, some of whom were talking excitedly about having had the chance of dancing with some good-looking soldiers in the progressives. Just their luck. By the time the evening was almost over, Amber looked across to where Luke was still talking to the serviceman, as if oblivious to what this evening was all about, or that he had a duty to take part in it. Well, not a duty exactly, but he could at least look interested. As if aware of her stare, if not her simmering resentment, he slowly turned his head to look straight at her, and gave her one of his stunning smiles. Her heart stopped, and then raced on again. And then she heard the compere announce that the next dance would be a ladies' excuse me, and that ladies shouldn't be shy about asking the gentleman of their choice to take a turn on the floor. She was hardly conscious of the fact that her feet had begun to move, or of the screams of laughter behind her as the other girls realized what she was going to do. She didn't pause as she wove between the couples already on the dance floor until she reached Luke's side, because if she had stopped for a moment, she knew she would never have had the nerve to do it. "Can I have the pleasure?" she croaked. One of the soldiers, talking to Luke, leered and gave him a nudge. "Go on, mate. Looks as if your luck's in tonight." Amber wanted to hit him for spoiling the moment, but incredibly it didn't. Luke stood up and took the hand she offered him. "I'd be honoured, my lady," he said with admirable dignity, considering they could still hear the hoots and catcalls of their old classmates. And then they were drifting, stumbling, falling over one another's feet in a crazy haphazard kind of a waltz, and all the time Luke held her close, knowing that if he didn't, they'd probably both end up in a heap on the floor. "We'll never make a championship pair," he said, with an apologetic laugh, when she winced as he trod on her toe for the umpteenth time, and then his voice changed to amazement. "My God, have you seen Granny Pen?" Amber looked over his shoulder, and there was her gran in the arms of the local greengrocer, doing as elegant a waltz as you like. Amber giggled. "I didn't know she had it in her," she said, stumbling again and leaning heavily into Luke, her arms tightening around him to keep her balance. "Sorry." "Don't be. You don't hear me objecting, do you?" Amber caught sight of Dolly's furious face with the other girls, and knew that she hadn't had the nerve to do what Amber had done. It made her feel good. It made her feel even better than she did already, and that was pretty wonderful. The music ended, and for one more brief moment she was still in Luke's arms before he released her. "I've got my dad's car tonight," he said casually. "Once the dance is over, we could drive to the top of the hill if you like, and see if we can see anything towards Plymouth. I reckon they had it tonight." "I don't know," Amber stammered. "Gran's here, and so is Dolly." "I wasn't asking them. I was asking you. But I can see it's not the best idea I've ever had." "Oh, but it is. It's a wonderful idea. But I don't expect I'd be allowed." She groaned as she said it, because if ever she felt her lack of years, she felt it now. Why couldn't she be 2 years older, the same as Luke, instead of not quite 15? All the feelings racing around inside her were every bit as adult as his, and she desperately wanted to do as he suggested. "Well, if you can, let me know," he said. They parted company, and a few minutes later she saw Granny Pen coming towards her. She composed her face, afraid that she might be giving something away, though she wasn't sure exactly what. But Granny Pen had other plans. "Amber, I'm leaving now, and I'm going to stay with Mr. and Mrs. Tremaine tonight. The poor soul's in need of some female company and understanding. So you and Dolly get off home when the dance finishes. I shouldn't think there'll be another raid tonight, but if there is, you know what to do. I'll be back in the morning in time for church." Amber wasn't sure if this was fate or if she had subconsciously wished for something like this to happen. It was horrible to think of that poor woman's misfortune as her own good luck, but all she had to do now was to make sure Dolly didn't get wind of her and Luke going off in his dad's car, and the very thought almost made her wet herself with excitement. Dolly's eyes lit up when she heard what Granny Pen was going to do. "Some of the girls are going down the quay for a look around, if you know what I mean. I didn't think I dared. But when the cat's away, eh? Are you coming?" "No, thanks. And you better be careful, Dolly. You know what I mean. There are lots of strangers and foreigners off the ships down there." "Oh, don't be so stuffy. Just because you never put a foot wrong," Dolly said with a sneer, which was a laugh, because that was just what Amber intended to do. It might seem a tame adventure to some, going up the hill in a car with a boy to see if they could see as far as Plymouth, but it all depended on the boy. "I'll see you back at the cottage then, and don't be too late," Amber warned. Dolly's eyes narrowed. "You're not up to something, are you?" "Of course not. What could I get up to?" When the evening officially ended, people left the Forces Club in dribs and drabs, some lingering to talk to friends, others anxious to get home. The night was chilly, and Amber was glad she and Luke weren't riding their bikes to the top of Pendennis Hill. It was far cosier and far more sophisticated to be going there in his dad's car, which he had only just learned to drive. Even so, She felt oddly tongue-tied as it chugged up the steep bends of the hill. It was weird, as if they hadn't known one another for years. It was as if they had just met and had to get to know one another for the first time. If only they knew the right words to say. "That was brave of you tonight, asking me to dance," he said at last. "I doubt if I'd have got up at all if you hadn't." "You're brave," she told him. "If you're going to join up some day, that'll be the bravest thing." Had she said those words to him before, or had she merely dreamed of saying them? She was confused, just sitting here beside him. He gave a short laugh. "Maybe I won't have much choice once I'm of an age to be conscripted. And it won't matter then if I feel brave or not." "But you want to go, don't you?" she said almost accusingly. The car rounded the last bend at the top of the hill before he turned off the engine and stopped. He turned to her, and in the dim interior his face was very close to hers. "Of course I do. It's what men do in a war." "But you're not a man yet." "No, and you're not grown up yet either, more's the pity. And I'm not about to be arrested for cradle-snatching," he said, sounding odd. Amber had thought for one glorious second that he was going to kiss her, but he pulled away from her with those words, which insulted and demoralized her. "So, are we going to get out of this blessed car, or are we going to sit here all night?" she snapped. She opened the door and stepped out, immediately feeling the wind whipping up her hair. She shivered, not so much from the cold, but from the sight that faced them. Plymouth was a long way away, but as now, when there had been a bad raid, it was always possible to see the red glow that hung like a pall over the distant city. Even if she couldn't smell the burning, she could imagine it, taste it even. Against the glow of the bomb damage, the barrage balloons in the sky hovered even more menacingly than usual. "Oh, my God," she whispered. She felt Luke's arms go around her from behind, sheltering her from the worst of the wind. Her hair was in his mouth, and he brushed it away. "It must be like something out of hell. All those poor people." "And did you hear about Bill Tremaine?" she said, her thoughts distractedly winging from one terrible event to another. "I did. And I'm beginning to think it was a mistake to come up here after all, and it's time I took you home," he said roughly. "You can't take everybody's tragedy on your own shoulders, Amber. We all have to live with it." "I know. And some people have to die with it," she said, the enormity of it all making her harsh. Without warning, he turned her around so that she was facing him, and he touched her mouth with his in a slow, sweet kiss. She could feel every part of herself pressing into him, and it was thrilling and exciting and a bit scary. She was soft, curving against him, and his body was harder and muscular. The difference had never seemed so acute to her as it did in those breathtaking moments. And then he let her go just as abruptly and turned to get back in the car. "Grow up soon, Amber," was all he said in a strangled kind of voice. "The Yanks are in!" Amber almost dropped the tray of knickknacks she was carrying as Luke burst into the shop early on the morning of December the 8th. She had hardly seen him since the night of the dance, and she'd begun to wonder if that kiss had been all in her imagination, after all. It was frustrating and infuriating to think that they had been so close in those few moments, and then it seemed as if he was keeping well away from her. Dolly had pumped her endlessly to ask where she had been that night, but Amber wasn't telling. Some secrets were too precious to share. Dolly had become an unexpected source of information, working as she did with older girls, who weren't reticent in telling stories of their escapades with the French sailors who were in port from time to time, and some of the Dunkirk refugees that they called ready, willing and able. "They have to be bleeding careful, mind," Dolly said importantly. "They don't want to get caught." "Who's going to catch them?" Amber said, not twigging at first. Dolly screamed with laughter. "Caught with a baby, you oik! Gladys at work says a bloke can get his what's-it up just by holding a girl too tight, and that's a sure way of heading for trouble. Blokes can't help it, see? It just happens." Amber had decided not to question Dolly any more, in case Dolly got suspicious as to why Amber was so interested in a bloke getting his what's-it up. But even though she'd put it so crudely, it explained a lot. Amber knew exactly now why Luke had pulled away from her on that night on Pendennis Hill, and why he wished she would grow up soon. It thrilled her and scared her. And now he was here, and they were face to face for the first time since that night, and she felt so embarrassed with her new-found knowledge of the workings of a bloke's what's-it that she could hardly look at him. All that sniggering stuff at school about rabbits flew out of the window, and her palms were damp. But she yelled at him now, unnerved at seeing him so unexpectedly in the aromatic intimacy of the little craft shop, and not yet understanding what he was shouting about. "What the hell are you on about? You nearly made me drop this lot." "The Yanks! It was on the wireless, and it'll be all over the papers soon. The Japs have bombed a place called Pearl Harbor, out in the Pacific, and the Yanks and Britain have declared war on Japan, so they're in." As her heartbeats stopped thudding, Amber looked at him coolly, determined not to give away anything about her churning feelings. "In where? In the Pacific?" From what she remembered of her sketchy geography lessons, it was so far away from Cornwall she couldn't even picture where the ocean was, let alone some place called Pearl Harbor that she'd never even heard about. Luke cursed, wanting her excitement to match his. "Christ almighty, Amber! Sometimes you can be the most infuriating girl in the world. You know damn well what I mean. The Yanks are our allies now, and pretty soon there'll probably be shiploads of them coming over here. That'll please you girls, won't it?" Mrs. Veal pushed through the bead curtain before Amber could think of a suitable reply, her face as animated as Luke's. "You're quite right, Luke, and it's a great day for us, even though it must have been dreadful for those poor American sailors in the thick of it. Their ships were bombed in that harbour without any warning." "Does everybody know about this but me?" Amber demanded. "Surely your Gran heard it on the wireless this morning," Mrs. Veal said. "It's not like her to miss anything." "And even if she hadn't heard it, are you sure she hasn't seen it coming in the tea leaves or the cards?" Luke said, mocking. Amber glared at him. "Well, for your information, our accumulator needs charging, and Gran was going to get it done after I came to work, so we didn't hear anything today. I wondered why so many people were standing about and gossiping in the streets, though. Is it so important that we have these Yanks with us, then?" She wasn't stupid, and she knew damn well how important it was. But she looked at Luke with innocent eyes, waiting for his explosion. She waited, but it didn't come. Instead, he caught her up in his arms and smacked a whopping great kiss on her cheek. It was their second kiss, but 1,000,000 miles away from the impact of the first one. "No wonder I love this crazy woman," he grinned at her. "You never know where you are with her, and it'll take an even crazier chap to tame her." He went out of the shop whistling, and the shop bell tinkled and echoed for a few seconds after he had gone, while Amber doubted if she had really heard those words. Had Luke Gillam actually said that he loved her? "Close your mouth, Amber, or you'll be catching flies," Mrs. Veal said dryly. "Come on through and let's see if Father's still twiddling with the wireless." She always referred to her husband as father, Amber thought vaguely, hardly registering anything else but the ecstatic fact that Luke Gillam had said he loved her. Of course, he hadn't said it in a romantic way. Of course, he hadn't really meant it. But he had said it, and Granny Penn always said that once words had been said, they no longer belonged to the person saying them, but to the person who heard them. Amber had never understood the logic of it, but it suited her to believe it now. She seemed to have been standing there motionless for so long that her legs jerked into action of their own accord when she heard Mrs. Veal calling to her again to come and hear the news. It was all true, then. The terrible onslaught of Japanese aircraft over this place called Pearl Harbor in the Hawaiian Islands had been nothing short of premeditated murder. The Americans hadn't been prepared, and no wonder, since Pearl Harbor was simply an American naval base way out in the Pacific Ocean, and they had had no quarrel with the Japanese. But they did now, and this war, which had once been between Britain and Germany, had all the potential to escalate into a worldwide conflict. Amber shivered with a huge sense of foreboding, wondering if she had more of her Gran's so-called sixth sense than she'd ever wanted. Everyone must feel like that now, but from the shouts and cheering that she could hear in the streets outside, she knew that the overriding feeling was one of jubilation that the Yanks were in. Throughout the day, it was impossible not to be drawn into those feelings, and there was huge optimism that with the might of the Americans alongside them, the war would soon be over. It would be the turning point. Even Dolly came dashing into the shop before closing time, her eyes wild with excitement after she had finished her shift at the Forces Club early. "Ain't it fantastic?" she shouted. "Everybody's saying the Yanks will be sure to be sent to Falmouth, what with the docks and all. Perhaps we'll get some of them film stars here as well. They'll have to join up, and they've always got lots of dosh, so if the war lasts a bit longer, I might find a rich millionaire to take me to America." She paused for breath to see Amber and Mrs. Veal laughing at her. What's so funny?" "You are," Amber said. "You're mad. Even if they do come here, it probably won't be for ages yet, and they're hardly going to look at kids like us practically straight out of school, are they? I'm not sure I want them looking at me, anyway." "That's because you think Mr. Wonderful Lukey Boy is the answer to every girl's dream. You should remember that Cornwall's not the end of the world, even though it perishing well seems like it to some people." She couldn't resist adding, "I wonder why you ever stay here, then. Got no choice, have I?" They glowered at one another, and then Amber began to laugh. Now that she had heard the news and realised what wonderful news it was, apart from the disaster at Pearl Harbor, she added hastily, she didn't want to be out of sorts with Dolly. They had been getting along too well of late for that. "Well, I'm sure you'll catch the eye of some Yank," she said generously. "You'll probably remind them of home, looking just like a Hollywood starlet. You do well in the flicks." Dolly looked at her suspiciously, and then patted her blonde curls, gloriously dishevelled now from the frantic bike ride here. "You're probably right," she said with massive self-confidence. "Anyway, if you've nearly finished here now, I'll wait for you." "You might as well go on home, Amber," Mrs. Veal said. "I doubt that I'd get much more work out of you today." "Do people ever buy any of this stuff?" Dolly said, peering around the shop. "Lots," Amber told her. "And I bet when the Yanks come, there'll be dozens of them in here, buying traditional Cornish souvenirs to send home," she added sweetly, and was rewarded by a scowl. It was the only news on anyone's lips over the next days and weeks. The newspapers were full of it, reporters turning into poets over how soon the war was going to be over now that the Americans were joining the Allies. There were many copycat headlines, such as, "The Yanks are coming," and "Good old Uncle Sam," until Granny Penn said sourly that it was a wonder the news rags didn't call it comparable to the second coming of Christ. "Blimey, coming from your churchified gran, that's blooming blasphemous, ain't it?" Dolly whispered to Amber in bed that night. "Yes, but Mr. Veal told me that older folks still remember how the Yanks were late in the last lot, and they're late in this." That's how he put it. But I don't see why people should take offence. It wasn't their war, was it? It is now. I wonder what they'll be like, Dolly said dreamily, clearly seeing Hollywood and stardom ahead. They won't understand your cockney gabble, that's for sure, Amber said. Well, do you think they'll understand you? They'll expect to see hayseeds growing out of the corner of your mouth. Amber snorted. I'm not rising to that bait, so shut up. Dolly leaned up on one elbow and looked across the moonlit room to the other bed. I know you've got your sights set on Luke Gillam, but if these Yanks are anything like they look at the flicks, it'll be exciting, won't it? Not everyone in America looks like a film star, you twerp. Most of them will be just ordinary. Now shut up and go to sleep. Let me go on dreaming of that moment when Luke said he loved me, she thought, her heart giving a little leap of happiness at remembering. Until today, she hadn't seen anything of him since the Forces Club dance, but she still cherished the memory of the ladies' excuse-me waltz when they had lurched around the dance floor, clutching one another to prevent themselves falling over, and then that sweet kiss at the top of Pendennis Hill, and now that kiss in the shop. Collectively, she knew that maybe none of it meant very much to him, but it did to her. Oh, yes, it did to her. It meant everything. And when he had asked her to grow up soon, she knew in her heart that it meant he would wait for her to do so. A few days after Britain and America declared war on Japan, Germany and Italy declared war on America, and other nations followed suit. It was almost as if they were choosing their enemies now in a horrible game of tit-for-tat, except that the stakes were far higher and deadlier. By December the 19th, all men aged between 18 and 64 in Britain had to register, and those between 22 and 44 were liable for military service. It was a chilling thought, but tempering it was the certainty that in due course thousands of American servicemen would be based in Britain as their jumping-off point for attacks on Europe. That Christmas was tentatively more joyful than in the past few years, because everyone felt they must be turning the corner in the war. Even though the Jerrys were still raining down bombs on the cities, and air raid warnings were regular occurrences, whether or not the planes came this far west, there was a feeling that it surely couldn't go on forever. I'm glad you're not 22 yet, Amber told Luke when he called at the shop to say hello, as he occasionally did now. They were good friends and always had been. They weren't courting, and since she was still 2 months short of her 15th birthday, Amber knew her gran would put her foot down at any suggestion of the sort, but she also knew in her heart that he was sweet on her, even if he never said so. A girl always knew. Why? You know I'd give anything to go right now if I could, Luke said in answer to her comment. I don't want you to be killed, that's why. Being killed isn't a requirement of joining up your dope, he said. I just like the chance to have a go at whipping the Jerrys. Well, it'll all be over long before you're old enough to go. Oh, yes. Have you been looking in your gran's crystal ball? No, I just know. You just wish. But you don't always get what you wish for, kid. I wish you'd take me seriously, she thought, and don't call me kid. For a moment she wondered if she'd said the words out loud, but she knew she couldn't have done. because he'd picked up a small polished piece of amber among a jumble of other semi-precious stones in the tray she'd been sorting through. "This is nice," he said. She answered on impulse. "If you ever have to join up, I'll buy it for you as a talisman. It's amber, in case you didn't know it, and it's meant to keep sailors safe at sea from the perils of the deep or something," she said lamely. "I suppose those awful German U-boats could be called perils of the deep, couldn't they?" He laughed. "Cuckoo as ever, I see. But I might take you up on it if it ever happens, and—" He hesitated. "It could be sooner than you think." If he was implying that worse was yet to come, she didn't want to know and wouldn't ask. But when he left the shop, she picked up the piece of amber, still warm from his touch, and informed Mrs. Veal that she wanted to buy it, and that she could take the money out of her wages. Then she was going to put it away safely, just as she put away all her personal and precious things until such time as they were needed, while praying that in this case it never would be. Side 6. Ever since she was little, Amber had listened to her gran making mysterious predictions, saying solemnly that good things always followed bad. It was balance and counterbalance, she'd say, putting the young Amber in awe of her, and making her wonder if her gran had swallowed the dictionary. But that meant it also worked the other way. Even if Granny Penn didn't mean to make the words mysterious, they had always seemed so to Amber, so that she was almost holding her breath at times, waiting for something good to happen, and apprehensive over what would come to counterbalance it. Her first kiss with Luke had been a good time, and then there had been the bad weeks when she hadn't seen him at all. Then there was that second kiss, but as the time passed and nothing bad had followed, she breathed easier again. Of course, she thought guiltily, she shouldn't be thinking only of herself. The wider world had far more disastrous bad things going on, but the Yanks becoming their allies had surely been a good thing, the best thing. So what was due next, good or bad? "You pay too much attention to your gran's daft sayings," Dolly told her. "She ain't a witch, even if I thought she might be when I first came here," she added with a grin. "She likes to be mysterious for her old biddies, because everybody knows that bad things happen in a war. Anyway, I've got a good thing going for me with Eddie now, so I ain't paying attention to what she says." "You want to be careful," Amber said, echoing Dolly's own words. Eddie Fielding had been in the class above them at school, a thin, spotty youth nobody had paid much attention to at the time. He worked at the docks now, and it was funny how time changed people, because it seemed as if he'd grown broader and better looking almost overnight, and when Dolly had bumped into him at the Saturday morning pictures, she'd been instantly smitten. It wouldn't last. Dolly's fads were swift and burned out just as swiftly, and if Granny Penn knew she was seeing Eddie every Saturday morning regular now, she'd definitely disapprove. "We don't do anything," Dolly said. "Just a bit of necking in the back row." Amber covered her ears. "Don't tell me any more. Then there's no danger of me giving you away," Dolly sighed. That's the difference between you and me, gal. I like playing the field. The field. Get it? With Eddie Fielding. But it ain't a forever thing. You want to forget all about Lukey boy and have some fun. And you want to make sure you don't get caught. What? With Eddie? I'm not sure he's even got a you-know-what, she sniggered. But take it from me, gal. Your gran just likes to stir things up with her good things, bad things tripe. The bad thing came for Amber when Luke came into the shop one Monday morning a month before her birthday. For a moment she felt as if the whole world was jangling around her, until she realised it was the previous customer leaving the shop, and it was merely the bell above the door. You aren't serious, are you, Luke? Tell me this is a joke. It's not a joke. I volunteered for the Navy. I'm leaving tomorrow for a naval training camp in Wales, so you won't see me for the next 6 weeks. He couldn't hide the pride in his voice any more than Amber could hide her bitterness that he hadn't even waited to be old enough to be called up. He'd simply volunteered. She felt cheated, as if Hitler or God or whoever was pulling the strings in this war was determined to take him away from her. But it was none of those people, wicked or spiritual, of course. It was Luke himself. He couldn't wait to go, to leave Cornwall, to be killed, to be drowned like her father had been drowned. The sea was taking both of them. Her head felt as if it was about to burst with the way her imagination was leaping about inside it. Are you all right? Luke said, and his face came back into focus. I'm not going away forever. Once I've joined a ship, I'll get leave, and I'll come home when I can. But I've got to do this. I thought you knew me well enough for that. I don't think I know you at all, she croaked. Luke, don't go. I've got a bad feeling about it. He laughed uneasily. Don't go all spooky on me, Amber. Leave that for Granny Penn. I dare say, if she looks in her cards for me, she'll see that I come back safe and sound. Don't make fun of her, nor me, Amber flared. Then she swallowed. If you have to do this, then do something for me. Wait here a minute. She turned and pushed through the bead curtain to the back of the shop. She stood quite still for a moment, her eyes closed, listening to her own ragged breathing. Please, keep him safe, she whispered to anyone who was listening. Please, bring him back to me. She rummaged in the little box where she kept her personal things at the shop, and then went back to where Luke was waiting. He was gazing through the shop window to where they could glimpse the sea, and in his mind she knew that already he had gone away from her to that world of adventure that belonged exclusively to men and boys. She had already lost him. I want you to have this, she said, thrusting a small, smooth object into his hand. Please keep it with you always, Luke, as a talisman. It's a friendship gift. She longed to say it was a gift of love, but she didn't dare. If she said such words, she would be in floods of tears, and he wouldn't want that. You didn't send a gladiator off to war with a tearful woman clinging to him. Not that she was quite a woman yet, according to all the rules of nature, but she had never known more womanly feelings for a man than she did right then. He opened his hand and saw the small, shiny piece of amber. Her stone. Her name. His mouth curved into a smile. My crazy girl, he said softly, and then closed his hand around the amber again. It'll never leave me. I promise. He kissed her for a third time, and wild horses couldn't have stopped her clinging to him then. Just for a moment. For a long, sweet moment that was goodbye. 15 wasn't too young to be in love, to want him to stay with her so badly that she was giddy with love. 15 was also the start of a rite of passage that told her when to hold her tongue and to pray for his safe return. It was only when the bell over the shop door tinkled again after his departure that she ran into the back room and let the tears pour out on Mrs. Veal's accommodating shoulder. Dolly said flatly that she shouldn't let herself get so worked up over a boy. "There's plenty more fish in the sea, if you'll pardon the pun," she said. "You're a bloody cold fish yourself," Amber raged, unable to resist swearing at her irritatingly calm face. "Nothing really touches you, does it? One of these days you'll get your comeuppance." "And who's been watching too many Hollywood flicks now, then?" "Get my comeuppance, indeed," Dolly mocked. "I'm expecting my mum and Uncle Joe to send me a postal order for my birthday, and that'll be all the comeuppance I need." She rarely mentioned her dad any more, thought Amber sourly. This Uncle Joe, who had a bit of dosh and was something to do with the black market, seemed to be favourite now, and since he could get anything they needed from one of his sources, Dolly's mum was apparently queening it among her neighbours. Dolly's comeuppance came on their 15th birthday, and it was nothing like she had expected. She waited eagerly for the postman to arrive, and when he handed her the letter with the London postmark, she tore it open. "You mind you don't tear up that postal order you're expecting as well, my girl," Granny Penn told her, but Dolly wasn't listening. Dolly was reading the letter her mum had sent her, and her face was even paler than usual. Her lips shook, and her eyes were blurry with tears and shock. "What's wrong, my dear?" Granny Penn said at once. Dolly gulped, and then managed to gasp out the words. "It's my dad. He's gone and got himself blown up and killed. And my mum's only just heard about it. She had one of them missing, believed, killed telegrams, and Uncle Joe went and got it confirmed. My dad's dead, and he ain't coming home no more." "Oh, my love, I'm so sorry," Granny Penn said, her arms going around the girl at once. "Come and sit down and take some deep breaths." "It's a rotten birthday present, isn't it?" Amber muttered without thinking, and immediately knew it was the very worst thing she could have said. "That's not all," Dolly said, choked. Her hands were still shaking as she clutched the letter. "This happened a month ago. Only being my mum, she didn't think to tell me because she didn't want to worry me, she said. Too busy enjoying herself, I bet. But now the bleeding neighbours have got all snooty about Uncle Joe being there so often. Well, living in our house is what she means. And she says she ain't going to be targeted as a bleeding scarlet woman. So although he's just her paying lodger, and if you believe that, you'll believe anything, I've got to go back home and work with her down the market to make it all respectable." Amber gasped. "She can't force you to go back to London where the bombs are falling. You live here with us. You're my sister. Well, sort of." "Dolly was only ever here as a temporary arrangement, Amber," Granny Penn said, seeing the distress on her granddaughter's face. "If her mother wants her back, then I'm afraid she'll have to do as she's told." "Do you want to go?" Amber demanded. Dolly was still shaking. "Of course I bleeding well don't. I never wanted to come here in the first place, but I'm sort of used to it now. But she sent the postal order for my train fare, and she says I've got to go back next Saturday." Amber didn't know what to say. It was the worst birthday either of them had ever known, and in the middle of it all was Dolly's grief over her dad, though it wasn't too much in evidence right now. The next minute her anger was obvious. "Why did my dad have to bleeding well go and get killed, the silly bugger? He was never much of a hero, and I bet he just lay down and let some jerry bugger blast him to kingdom come." Granny Penn couldn't let this go on any longer. "Dolly, you're understandably upset, and we all say things we don't mean at such times. But this is a Christian house, and I can't tolerate this sort of language any longer. I suggest we all close our eyes for a few moments and think kindly of your dad and how he died for his country. There are more ways of being a hero than going into battle with all guns blazing." "Where'd you hear that?" "At the flicks," Dolly muttered. and then had the grace to do as the others were doing and sit with her head bowed. As she did so, the tears began to slide down her face, an angry few at first, and then a torrent. Amber threw her arms around her and held her tight. It had all happened so fast that it was only just dawning on her that Dolly was leaving. She had lost Luke, and now she was losing Dolly, and it was all the fault of that bloody war. "We mustn't lose touch," she said fiercely into Dolly's tangle of hair. "We must write to one another all the time, and then we'll feel as close as we do now." Dolly pushed her away, lashing out at those nearest to her. "Perhaps I don't want to feel close to you Cornish hayseeds any longer. Perhaps I'm glad to be going back where I belong." The bravado lasted all of 10 seconds, and then she was sobbing and pulling Amber back to her, and promising to write all the time, sharing their secrets as they had begun to do lately. Granny Pen cleared her throat, trying to lighten the gloom. "So, seeing as how this is a birthday, why don't you girls help me see if there's anything in the larder to make a cake for tea?" On Saturday morning, the train station bustled with civilians and servicemen, some coming, some going. Most of them had grim faces, except for the lucky ones who were greeting a loved one returning home. Dolly had said goodbye to her workmates at the Forces Club and done the rounds of the people she knew, the old school friends, the church ladies, and Granny Pen's cronies. By now, Dolly had assumed the role of a martyr, alternately infuriating and amusing Amber. But now that the moment of parting was almost here, there was nothing artificial about the misery in both girls' eyes. What had begun nearly 3 years ago as a necessary annoyance in both their lives had turned into the best kind of friendship, the kind that survived, despite, or because of, knowing each other's faults. "I'll miss you like mad," Amber gulped, hugging her for a last moment. "Soppy date," Dolly said, her chin wobbling. "You can have that bedroom all to yourself now, and you won't miss me at all." "Yes, I will." "Come on now, you two," Granny Pen said, before an argument started that neither could win. "It's time to go, Dolly." Granny Pen was only given to hugging and kissing in exceptional circumstances, so she was startled when Dolly threw her arms around her and planted a smacker on the old woman's cheek. "You ain't been so bad," Dolly told her, reverting to type, and then she gathered up her bags and gas mask and boarded the train, pushing past some soldiers in the corridor to get into a compartment and squeeze into a window seat, disregarding the grumbles of everyone else. By the time the train pulled out, sparking on the tracks and sending clouds of steam into the air, Dolly was also sharing a saucy laugh with a young soldier in the same compartment. Whatever else happened in this war, Amber had to agree that Dolly would almost certainly come up smelling of roses. After so long, the cottage felt strange without her. Amber felt lost in a different way from the way she felt lost over Luke's departure. Dolly had had no choice but to do as her mother asked, and eventually Amber knew she had come to terms with that, even looking forward to the nightly dash for the tube station when the sirens went as a big adventure. But Luke didn't have to go at all. He wasn't 18 yet, so he wasn't old enough to be conscripted, and he didn't have to go and volunteer for the Navy. She knew he must have lied about his age, and Amber was furious at the stupidity of boys wanting to be heroes who went away to war before they needed to. After church on Sunday, she came face to face with Luke's mother. Like Granny Pen, Mrs. Gillam was a God-fearing woman and always spoke her mind. "I hear you've lost your little friend Amber, and we've lost our Luke. So I hope you paid special attention when the vicar told us to pray for all our brave men and women, girls and boys, who are working hard to bring us to victory." Amber's temper flared in an instant. It wasn't the place and it wasn't the time, but she had never heard anything so damn stupid in her life. I'd hardly call what Dolly Nash is doing bringing us to victory, she mimicked. She's gone back to London because her mother wants her to help on some market stall. And Luke didn't have to volunteer, did he? I thought he was supposed to be doing something hush-hush with Mr. Gillam at the boatyard that was all important to the war effort. Amber was all too aware of her gran bearing down on her at that moment, and she desperately hoped she hadn't overheard her caustic remark. I know you're upset over Luke volunteering, Amber, but his father and I are very proud of him, Luke's mother said quietly. But in Dolly's case, I think you're forgetting that her father has just been killed, and I'm sure it will be a traumatic homecoming for her. Her mother will need her now, and we must all learn the meaning of compassion in these difficult times. Recklessly, Amber opened her mouth to say just what she thought about Dolly's mother needing her now. Whether she really would have blurted it all out about the black market, Uncle Joe, or Dolly's mother's late-in-the-day need to appear respectable, she didn't know, because the iron grip of Granny Penn's hand on her wrist effectively stopped her. We're all feeling a little overwrought these days, Mrs. Gillam, and it's harder for the young, Granny Penn said. They haven't been through it all before the way we older ones have, and there's a lesson in tolerance to be learned for all of us. Amber squirmed as her gran made excuses for her, while wondering if Mrs. Gillam would think the words were intended as a bit of a slight on herself. Apparently she didn't, because she smiled at Amber. Your gran's a wise woman, Amber. You'll be missing Dolly, of course, and I know you and Luke were great chums too. So, how would you like to come and have some tea with me tomorrow afternoon when you finish work? That would be nice, thank you, Amber said, taken unawares by the request, and not sure if this was a sop or not. As for her and Luke being great chums, well, she supposed that in everyone else's eyes that's what they were. Great lovers they certainly were not. Not even sweethearts. Just great chums. She supposed the words were intended to please her, she thought, as the Gillams moved away, but they just filled her with added misery. If she wasn't careful, she'd be wallowing in it soon. It was better to keep the anger uppermost than to keep feeling sorry for herself. I won't say what I thought of you back there, Amber, her gran said, striding ahead of her so fast that Amber had a job to keep up. At this rate, she'd be having a heart attack soon, Amber thought uncharitably, and immediately willed the thought away, because Granny Penn's demise was too frightening to be contemplated. I'm sorry, she said. I wasn't thinking, and the words just came out. Granny Penn slowed down a little as they left the church grounds and reached the road. You shouldn't think too much about this Gillam boy, Amber. You're far too young to have your head filled with any romantic nonsense. Luke's almost 18, she said defensively. Granny Penn looked at her sharply, noting the flushed face and the slender curving shape of her, so aggressive now. She was like a mother defending her young, except that this was no maternal feeling her granddaughter was experiencing, Granny Penn thought in alarm. This was first love, raw and painful. Where have I been all this time? She asked herself angrily. For one supposedly so far-seeing, I seem to have missed what was right under my nose. First love could be powerful and intense. It usually faded in time, but sometimes it never did. You should see some of your old school friends again, my dear, she told Amber, gentler now. You and Dolly relied far too much on one another's company. I dare say she'll remember to write to you now and then, but don't bank on it. Well, I know she will, and I'll write to her too. I'll write to her this very night and get her to tell me everything about what it's like in London. You never know. I might want to go and visit her there one day. You might, but you won't stay. People always come back to Cornwall. It has a special pull on them. It has to do with the land and the sea and the old Celtic ways, and the fact that we taper down to the ocean at Land's End, as if there's no need for anything more except the traditional living of good Cornish folk." "Good Lord, no wonder people say you have some weird ideas, Gran," Amber said. But she was starting to grin in spite of herself, and she tucked her arm inside her grandmother's as they began to walk more slowly. "Don't scoff. Don't you think Luke Gillam will come back to Cornwall once he's gone to sea and seen the world? Don't you think there's a strong enough pull here for him?" Amber flushed. "You said all that mysterious stuff deliberately, didn't you?" "What if I did? Whatever anybody says, you should always try to take the truth out of it for whatever suits you and discard the rest. If you believe in something strongly enough, it will happen." There was a time when Amber was a young child, when she loved listening to Granny Penn's deliciously mysterious tales of old tin miners and the cheeky underground gnomes who teased or tormented them, the tales of pirates and smugglers and caves, the mysteries of the ancient standing stones and stone circles, the quoits and menhirs, where wishes were made and trysts were kept. She hadn't known what half the words meant then, but they had charmed her all the same. But she was no longer a young child, agog at all these ancient tales, and she wasn't prepared to accept that if you believed in something it would happen. She had foolishly believed that, because of his age, Luke would be safe for years yet, and look where that had got her. But as Granny Penn stumbled over the rough ground and clung a little more tightly to Amber, she was adult enough to hold her tongue. To her surprise, Dolly became an avid letter writer. She had got over her dad's death surprisingly quickly, Amber thought cynically. But that was Dolly, never at a loss at making the best of things. She'd eventually made the best of living in Cornwall, but London was home, and it was obvious that she was glad to be back there, and that Uncle Joe was now the kingpin in her life. "He ain't so bad," Dolly wrote. "He brings stuff home for Mum and me that we ain't supposed to brag about, if you know what I mean. He don't worry me no more, and he's good to us. Working down the market is a lark, too. Of course, it ain't so good when the jerry planes come over and we have to make a dash for the tube, but they usually come of a night. It's a bit scary in the daytime when you hear the planes coming over, though, and a couple of stalls at the other end of the market got a direct hit, which put the frighteners up Mum and me for a bit. But so far, we're okay. Oh, yes, and the street next to us has had it, and old Mr. Anna, the Jew boy, and his sons, who ran a clothes shop near us, all got killed. But Uncle Joe managed to get some of their stock for our stall, no questions asked, and so say bomb-damaged goods. See? It's an ill wind, as they say, so we're still smiling. It's a bit of fun down the tube sometimes. We've all got our places for sleeping now, and we go down there of a night more often than not. You know how we was once wondering how people would all get on doing married things? Well, they just get on and do it. Those that ain't shit scared of being bombed in mid-flow, if you see what I mean. There's so much noise with families all crammed together and the screaming kids and yapping dogs that nobody takes no notice. We're always glad to get out of there in the morning, mind, to breathe a bit of fresh air after some of the stinks down there, even though you can hardly call it fresh air by then. The streets are always full of smoke and smells of burning and dust and blood and dead bodies. Am I making you puke yet? When Uncle Joe was grubbing around in the bomb rubble one morning, he found somebody's arm. Can you imagine that? Just an arm? How can you identify just an arm? Anyway, you better not let Granny Penn read this, or she'll be reaching for the smelling salts. How is the old girl, by the way? And have you heard anything from Lukey boy? Remember me to one and all. Your pal, Dolly. Amber was always exhausted by the time she came to the end of one of Dolly's letters. She read out the bits that she thought would interest Granny Penn, but wisely didn't hand them over for her to read. She thought the underground shelters sounded like sheer hell, and the horrific and matter-of-fact way Dolly spoke about Uncle Joe finding just an arm made her retch. She didn't want to think about what he might be looking for. grubbing about in the bomb rubble either. Dolly's letters made her realise how lucky she was to be living in Cornwall. Because of the docks, Falmouth had its share of raids, but nothing like the worst onslaught of the German bombers, and she really wished Dolly hadn't had to go back to London. Being apart had somehow made the bond between them stronger than before, and she tried to make her own letters cheerful and full of local incidents to make Dolly smile. "I had one letter from Luke, not long after he went away," she wrote. "He said he was sorry he'd got me all upset, but he felt it was his duty to do what he could. He's still doing square bashing, so he's not exactly playing the big hero, being stuck in some Welsh training camp for 6 weeks. When he does get on a ship, though, he may be away for much longer, and he won't even be allowed to tell me where it's going. Does he think I'm a German spy or something? That's a joke, ha ha." She nearly tore that up and started again. It sounded mean and petty and stupid. But that was because right then she was feeling mean and petty, because Luke hadn't even ended his letter in the way she would have liked. It was just signed Luke, and not even a kiss at the end. The only thing that had made her heart leap for a moment was the P.S. he had added. "I'm keeping my amber safe, like I promised." She would dearly have loved to read something into that, but she was being so damn pernickety now, telling herself it was probably deliberate that he had written Amber and not Amber, to keep her in her place as a friend and nothing more. But she wasn't going to care. If he didn't want her, she wouldn't want him. She continued her letter to Dolly. "I may join a drama group again, a proper one this time. It's one evening a week, and they're putting on a play that somebody local has written. I've been once, but I'm still making up my mind whether I really want to do it. It's supposed to poke fun at Hitler, but some of the lines are so feeble, nobody's going to find them funny. They're even worse than old Tomo's. I wish you were here to liven things up." She'd only gone to the drama group to stop Granny Penn telling her she was moping too much, and she might not even go again. She paused again, thinking that this whole letter sounded feeble compared with the daring and dangerous life Dolly was living now. Racing to get to the underground shelter at night before the bombs fell, and sharing a house with her mum and the dodgy-sounding Uncle Joe was a world away from sharing the cottage with Granny Penn, where nothing much happened. Sometimes Amber knew exactly why Luke had wanted to do something. Sometimes she wished she was old enough to volunteer to do something useful for the war effort as well, instead of being a perishing assistant in a craft shop. It was hardly saving the world. The wireless and newspapers were so full of reports of the war that the ordinary lives of people sometimes seemed to fade into the background. Luke came home briefly after his 6 weeks' training, looking older and smarter in his uniform and itching to board his ship in Portsmouth. Late in April, the German bombers struck the towns of Exeter and Bath heavily, followed by vicious attacks on Norwich and York. Although the raids were obviously aimed at key towns and cities, they were so indiscriminate that nowhere seemed safe anymore. Many people lost their lives and homes were flattened. It was becoming a frighteningly familiar story. Everyone was unnerved, wondering who was going to be hit next. The papers screamed out that the German raids were retaliation for the way the RAF had devastated the Baltic port of Lübeck in March, which sounded as alien as the moon to most British people, and most said it simply proved the senseless futility of war. "Pray to God they don't get this far west too often," Granny Penn commented. "The docks ought to be a prime target, but so far we've been let off lightly compared with Portsmouth and Plymouth." Amber hated it when her gran got all serious like this, but how could she help it? How could anyone help it, even a 15-year-old, when the only thing people seemed to talk about was death and destruction, and gloomy faces were all that you saw in the streets now. Even these Americans, who were supposed to be their allies, were off fighting the Japanese in the Pacific now, instead of being over here. But that was understandable, considering it was the chaps who first got them into the war. What with the letters from Dolly and the lack of letters from Luke, Amber felt constantly on edge, wondering if anything was ever going to be normal again. She wondered where Luke was, and if he was safe. She couldn't bear the news that British ships were being sunk by these terrible German U-boats. Submarines must be the worst and most wicked enemy of all, she thought, gliding silently beneath the waves, ready to strike at any moment. But submarines had been blown out of the water too, and everyone inside them would have been drowned. She shuddered. Because of her father, the thought of drowning petrified her, and the very idea of the sea crushing the sailors to death in a submarine made her feel tight in her chest, as if she couldn't breathe, as if she was drowning too. One particular April morning, she pedalled to work in a furious temper, willing such morbid thoughts away, while raging in her heart against the stupid bureaucracies who had made all this happen. She'd been caught out in a sharp April shower, and she was damp and chilled by the time she reached the shop, only to find that it was locked and silent. Mrs. Porter from the chandlery nearby was looking out for her, and she appeared as soon as Amber had leaned her bicycle against a side wall, red and flustered. Mrs. Porter was a busybody as well as a panicky sort, and Amber sighed impatiently as she saw her wringing her hands like a bad actress. "Oh, lovey, I'm glad you're here. I've been waiting to give you the news." "What is it today, Mrs. Porter?" More gossip about the war, she supposed. It must be something big, if Mrs. Veal hadn't bothered to open the shop yet. The woman's voice was shrill. "It's poor Mr. Veal. He was rushed off to hospital in the ambulance in the middle of the night. They say it's a heart attack, but Mrs. Veal hasn't come back yet, so we don't know how bad it is. She left the key for you to open up as usual," the woman added, her eyes like dinner plates, as she waited for Amber's reaction. It was hard for Amber to take in. The weight of the war news had been so oppressive lately that something as ordinary as a perfectly nice elderly man being rushed off in the middle of the night with a heart attack was almost ludicrous. As the shameful thought flashed in and out of her mind, she knew it wasn't ludicrous at all. It was awful, and her thoughts were all at 6s and 7s as Mrs. Porter thrust the key into her hand, hot and sweaty from where she had been clutching it for so long. "She wants me to open up the shop as usual," Amber stammered. "Are you sure that's what I'm supposed to do?" "Well, as far as we know, the poor old dab hasn't gone yet, so it's best to do as she says, my dear." "Gone? Gone where?" Amber said, not understanding for a moment, and then she gasped. "You don't mean he's going to die?" The woman gave an exaggerated shrug, her eyes rolling. "His mouth looked a fair shade of blue when they took him out, so it don't look too good." She would have noted everything, of course, and passed it around to anybody who was willing to listen. Right then, Amber hated her. "I'd better do as Mrs. Veal wanted and open up," she said, wanting to get away from the woman as quickly as possible, as she fumbled to get the key in the door. Once inside, she slammed it behind her, effectively keeping everybody else out for the moment. The shop bell jangled, echoing in the silent shop now, and Amber felt her own heart beating rapidly in a way she had never been aware of before. It was drumming in her ears. And then she realized the drumming was the sound of someone rapping on the shop door behind her. She was tempted to push the bolt across, but Mrs. Porter knew she was in there and would probably just keep hammering until she answered it. She moved away from the door, and then it opened. "My goodness," said a familiar voice. "I thought I was being shut out of my own shop for a minute, and I can't abide these blessed April showers. Oh, Amber, love, don't take on so. Everything's all right, truly it is." "Mrs. Veal, I didn't expect to see you yet," she gasped, almost hysterical. The woman gave a faint smile. "You expected to see me in widow's weeds already, did you? No, Father's made of tougher stuff than that, my dear, and he'll be around for a long time yet, God willing."
"But Mrs. Porter said—"
"Mrs. Porter means well, but she's an old scaremonger. I've put her right, so she won't go around asking the neighbours for a wreath just yet."
"So Mr. Veal isn't— is he going to be all right?"
"It was just a bit of a warning, that's all," his wife said briskly. "The old fool decided to have a feast with his cheese ration, and mine too. I told him it was too late at night, but would he listen? Do they ever? No, they don't. So then, of course, he got terrible indigestion and convinced himself he was having a heart attack and insisted that I sent for the ambulance." She was prattling on much faster than usual, which told Amber that Mr. Veal hadn't been the only one to have a scare during the night.
"Shall I make us a cup of tea?"
she asked tentatively. "That would be nice, Amber, love. And while you put the kettle on, I'll go upstairs and take off my hat and coat and have a little cry. And by the time I come down again, I'll be as right as rain." Amber watched her go with something like awe.